It's an insane thought to think about legalizing drugs in today's world. In school, you're taught how drugs are bad, how the people who do them are bad, how the people who sell them are bad. You hear horror stories about the side effects of drugs. You hear about neighborhoods that have high drug usage, have a lot of crime, and are bad areas. And this might lead you to think that all drugs really should be outlawed. It seems like they are pretty bad. And let's say that you do that. Let's say you start a war on drugs, like the US once did. And now, it's not like the US might have done that because of racial reasons in a certain presidential administration, maybe called Richard Nixon. Now, let's see what happened with the US's war on drugs. That's odd. The US has 25% of the world's prison population. The US has 1.3 million people in prison. And black people have a 5.1 more times to be in prison than a white person. And now there's also an opioid epidemic going on, and because drugs are illegal, we can't even understand how they work to maybe help people with GMO issues. So how can this be fixed if the drug on war and outlawing drugs is a total failure? Aren't drugs supposed to be bad? Maybe instead of treating drugs like they're bad, we treat them more like a science and like a disease. Drugs are also everywhere, from advertisements to TV to seeing people just use them on the streets, that it might be hard to stop drugs. And maybe if drugs are legal, you could actually find more ways to help people than to hurt people. Now, legalizing drugs has two ways of doing it. Full out legalization, but the government will always have control and will never actually be full on legal, or decriminalization of drugs, where doing drugs isn't seen as bad and you don't go to jail for it, and you might actually just be more led to help, or like an AA meeting, something like that, being led to help rather than criminal punishment, which helps the person who's doing drugs because they aren't viewed as a bad person, so they don't keep doing it, and they're actually led towards help. They're encouraged to get help instead of making them seem like a bad person. They're seeing like a person who's struggling, having a bad problem, needs help, which is how that person wanna get help is encouraging. It's more better for someone to like feel good about themselves so they want to stop rather than putting them in negative situations and just wrecking their life and how they're getting a job. Decriminalization drugs helps with that. It also helps with prisons. Like in the US, a lot of cases of people going to jail are because they had possession of drugs. They weren't selling it, they just had possession. And that could really help those cases. Now, a full legalization system of drugs, which really cannot happen in the US because they do not have a Medicare for all or universal healthcare system, so the government really wouldn't be able to control it, so it really probably wouldn't work in the US. However, it does happen in Europe where now it's not fully legal, and they do sell, like the government will sell a limited amount of drugs, and sort of like how abortions work in the US, but kind of the opposite version of it being a good version where they'll give you a pamphlet if you buy drugs, where to stop, where to get help, and it's ultimately a lot of encouragement to get jobs to get into a rehab program, and it acknowledges that drugs are addictive and that they need help, and that it doesn't let them go to a shady buyer to get them, which is another good reason for legalizing drugs, is they're not going to get bad things and endanger themselves even more with bad people. A plus side to both is that while legalization probably might actually help them the most, it's just like decriminalization on steroids, but decriminalization has a lot of the same principles and it's built into it. It decriminalizes it and helps people who have possession not get in trouble, which could really help them succeed in getting rehab. And it helps with that prison population that the U.S. desperately needs to fix, with its outrage of the racial makeup of it being overwhelmingly black. And decriminalizing legalized drugs is a helpful step forward to fixing that. It is not the full solution, but it could be a great solution to help fix it, which both do. Another reason that legalizing drugs might actually make more sense is because of the reason why we made it illegal was based off of racism. From presidential administrations like Richard Nixon's, Ronald Reagan's, and the Bushes. For instance, President Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while appearing not to, and that system was designed to be drugs. This was told by someone in Richard's administrations. And you see this more as the Nixon campaign in 1968, the Nixon White House after that, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So making drugs illegal might also just be based off of a lie. Legalizing drugs is an interesting thing to open to your mind to, as its roots in racism and our misconceptions of it are interesting to think about how legalizing, doing the opposite of what we did, could help millions of people get clean and be healthier from drug addiction.